If uncovering the unknown and the truth behind history excites you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications, because what you're about to see isn't just a video, it's a journey through time. In the ashes of the Great War, Europe stood silent. The guns had stopped, but the wounds beneath the silence screamed louder than ever. A generation was lost, and nations, broken, humiliated, stripped of pride, searched for someone to blame. Germany's defeat birthed not peace, but resentment. In dim taverns and crumbling cities, whispers of vengeance began to stir. The Treaty of Versailles, meant to secure peace, instead planted the seeds of another catastrophe. Poverty and chaos became the stage on which a single man promised redemption. His voice echoed across a desperate nation. Germany will rise again. The crowd believed, and the world looked away. What they didn't know was that the spark had already been lit, and this time, the fire would engulf the planet. 1933. The world was trying to rebuild, but in Germany the ground trembled with new power. Adolf Hitler rose like a storm, carried by anger and despair. His promises were simple: jobs, unity, glory. His methods, terrifying. Flags replaced thought, and obedience became faith. Propaganda turned fear into worship. Radios preached salvation. Schools molded soldiers, not minds. The swastika, once meaningless, became a new sun in a darkening sky. Across borders, few understood what was truly awakening. The world called it revival. History would call it the rebirth of madness. In the heart of Europe, an empire of hate began to march, not with swords, but with conviction. And soon, its echo would reach every corner of the earth. September 1st, 1939. The morning light over Poland was shattered by steel and fire. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was more than a tactic. It was terror made mechanical. Tanks roared like thunder. Skies burned with screaming dive bombers. In just weeks, Poland fell. The world held its breath. Britain and France declared war, but hesitation was their first enemy. One by one, nations collapsed under the weight of the Nazi machine. In France, the tricolor flag sank beneath a sea of gray uniforms. In London, air raid sirens wailed like ghosts. The world had plunged into its darkest chapter again. But this time, death had engines, and cruelty had science. Far to the east, Japan sought empire. The rising sun demanded land, oil, and blood. China burned, its cities reduced to rubble, its people to ashes. Soldiers marched with blind devotion, fueled by the idea of divine destiny. The Pacific trembled. And as the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, tightened their grip on the world, democracy itself began to fade. The war was no longer about territory. It was about the soul of humanity. Could reason survive in a world ruled by fear? Could compassion endure under the boots of tyranny? The storm had become global, and the line between conqueror and monster had vanished. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler turned east toward the vastness of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, expecting victory in weeks. Instead, they met an enemy that would not die. The Russian winter, merciless, eternal, froze tanks in place and men in fear. Villages burned, cities crumbled, and yet the Red Army held the line. Stalingrad became hell on earth. For every street, every building, men fought, bled, and starved. When the snow melted, the myth of German invincibility melted with it. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the world saw the beginning of the end. The snows of Russia swallowed entire armies. What was meant to be a triumph became a graveyard of ambition. Frozen corpses marked the roads to Moscow, reminders that arrogance had a price. Hitler refused to retreat. Pride blinded him, even as his soldiers begged for mercy from the frost. Civilians starved, villages vanished, and Europe trembled. But deep within that chaos, a new strength rose: resistance. Across occupied lands, whispers turned into action. French partisans, Polish couriers, Soviet snipers, all fought not for conquest, but for survival, for dignity. Humanity was beginning to push back. The war that once seemed unstoppable was slowly meeting its match: the unbroken will of ordinary people. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America watched the flames grow. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke carefully, his voice calm but heavy. "We will not stand by while freedom burns." Yet isolation held strong, until one morning changed everything. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The sky erupted in fire. Battleships turned to twisted steel, and the Pacific bled smoke. The sleeping giant had been awakened. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan, and by extension, the Axis. Factories roared to life. Men enlisted, women built planes, and a generation prepared to fight for a future they might never see. The world's balance had shifted. The tide was turning. In North Africa, the desert became a battlefield of sand and strategy. Under the scorching sun, tanks clashed like metal beasts. Rommel, the desert fox, danced across dunes with unmatched precision until Allied forces, learning his rhythm, struck back. Every grain of sand hid sweat, blood, and determination. In the skies above, British pilots engaged in dogfights over the Sahara, tracing death in circles of smoke. For the first time, the Nazi war machine stumbled. The Allies had found their momentum. Hope, faint and fragile, began to rise again, like dawn over endless desert plains. In the shadows of occupied Europe, a different kind of war raged. Underground networks formed. Ordinary citizens risking everything to fight tyranny. They forged false papers, sabotaged trains, whispered secrets through radio static. The resistance wasn't an army of soldiers, but of souls. In the darkest corners, courage lived. A mother hiding a stranger in her basement. A child delivering messages through forests. A priest defying death to save the condemned. Their names may be forgotten, but their defiance shaped the fate of nations. The war was not only fought with guns, it was fought with conscience. As the Allies advanced through Italy, the dream of the Axis began to crumble. Mussolini's empire of illusion fell to pieces. The once mighty fascist stood powerless, hunted by his own people. In the ruins of Rome, soldiers prayed beneath shattered cathedrals, wondering if God had turned away. Yet amidst destruction, beauty survived. Music played in bombed theaters. Love letters crossed front lines. Even in war, the human heart refused to die. The Allies pressed forward, inch by inch, toward the final confrontation. They knew the road to Berlin would be long, but behind every step was a single belief: that tyranny, no matter how loud, would not outlast the truth. By 1943, the Axis dream began to fracture. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans west, reclaiming each frozen street with unbearable loss. At Kursk, the largest tank battle in history thundered across the fields. The earth itself trembled under steel. Men fought not for ideology, but to survive the next minute. In the air, dogfights painted the sky with fire. In the mud, soldiers clung to life, whispering names of loved ones as mortars screamed overhead. The Nazi vision of conquest began to rot from within. The invincible army was bleeding. And for the first time, the world sensed it. The monster could be slain. In the Atlantic, another invisible war raged. Submarines, the dreaded U-boats, hunted merchant ships beneath dark waves. Convoys vanished without trace, swallowed by the sea. But Allied scientists fought back with sonar, radar, and code-breaking brilliance. The Enigma machine, once thought unbreakable, fell to human intellect. In secret rooms filled with smoke and whispers, mathematicians changed the course of war. Every intercepted message, every decrypted line, meant lives saved. It was a war of minds, not bullets. Proof that genius, too, can be a weapon. Beneath the surface of chaos, intelligence was winning. While armies clashed across continents, the true horror unfolded behind barbed wire. The Holocaust, a systematic industrial extermination of millions. Jews, Roma, the disabled, dissenters, entire families erased from history. Trains carried human cargo to death factories disguised as camps. The air itself became witness. Gas chambers replaced justice. Silence replaced prayer. But even in this abyss, courage survived. In the whispers of resistance within the camps, in smuggled notes, in the defiance of a song sung by those who knew they would not live to finish it. Evil had a face, and the world could no longer deny it. Across the Pacific, war burned with relentless fury. The islands of the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, became names written in blood. American Marines crawled through jungles and fire, facing an enemy that would rather die than surrender. Kamikaze pilots fell from the sky like burning prayers. The ocean turned red, the air filled with ash. Yet each island taken brought the Allies closer to Japan's doorstep. The cost was unimaginable, but retreat was no longer an option. Humanity had crossed a line. It would either destroy tyranny or destroy itself trying. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The longest day in human history. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy under a hail of gunfire. Waves carried men to their fate. Sand turned crimson. And yet, they advanced. It was chaos. It was courage. It was sacrifice made flesh. By nightfall, the beach was theirs. Europe had a heartbeat again. The liberation of the continent had begun. But for every step forward, 1,000 lives were left behind. D-Day was not a victory. It was a vow. A promise to end the darkness once and for all. As the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, Europe awakened from its nightmare. Towns long buried under the Nazi flag saw sunlight and freedom again. French resistance fighters emerged from shadows to join the liberation. Bells rang over Paris, not for victory yet, but for hope. Still, the path to Berlin was a corridor of death. Every bridge, every hill, every forest was defended with desperation. The Luftwaffe rained fire, cities burned, and refugees flooded the roads. Behind the front lines, medics stitched life from chaos. The world had turned into one vast heartbeat, pounding, bleeding, unstoppable. The enemy was retreating, but the war's final act had only just begun. In the Pacific, the sky had no mercy. The Battle of Leyte Gulf roared across the seas, the largest naval battle in human history. Waves thundered beneath aircraft carriers, and the ocean burned. Kamikaze attacks struck like divine vengeance, each pilot choosing death over defeat. For soldiers watching from below, the horizon was fire. Yet the Allied fleet endured, driven by sheer will. Japan's power began to fracture, its empire collapsing like glass under pressure. But the cost, the cost, was unbearable. Each victory felt like another piece of humanity lost to the tide. Back in Europe, the winter of 1944 brought one last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate strike. In the frozen forests of Ardennes, American soldiers faced encirclement, outnumbered and outgunned. Snow fell thick, muffling screams. Tanks lurked between trees like predators. But courage doesn't freeze. They held the line. Against all odds, the Allies endured. It was the final breath of a dying regime. When the fog lifted, the German army was broken. The end was near, yet peace felt further than ever. For every life saved, another was lost. The world was bleeding toward redemption. As Allied forces closed in, the truth of the Nazi Empire began to surface. Camps were discovered: Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau. Soldiers entered, expecting prisoners, but found ghosts. The smell of death hung thick in the air, the silence unbearable. Cameras rolled, documenting what the human mind could barely comprehend. Generals wept. Hardened men dropped their rifles. The war had always been about freedom, but in that moment, it became something more. A confrontation with humanity's darkest reflection. The victors realized they hadn't just defeated an enemy. They had uncovered the abyss within us all. April 1945. Berlin burned. The Reich that was meant to last 1,000 years lay in ruins after 12. In the Führer bunker, Hitler faced the end he had created. Outside, Soviet artillery roared. Inside, he swallowed the poison of his own madness. Flags were raised over the Reichstag, and silence fell. The war in Europe was over, but victory tasted of ash. Cities lay in rubble, millions dead, hearts hollowed by loss. Yet somewhere amid the ruins, a child found a flower pushing through the cracks of concrete. Life, fragile, stubborn, miraculous, was beginning again. The war in Europe had ended, but the Pacific still burned. Japan refused surrender, clinging to pride as its last weapon. Cities were shattered, people starving, yet the command cried, "Fight to the last." Then came a new force, not of men, but of science. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima became the first city in history to vanish in a single flash. The bomb fell, and daylight turned to death. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Mushrooms of fire climbed to the heavens, and silence devoured the world. Humanity had unlocked the ultimate power, the power to erase itself. The war was over. But something deeper had begun. The atomic age, and the fear that we had gone too far to return. After the bombs, Japan stood in ruins, cities flattened, rivers choked with ash. Emperor Hirohito's voice echoed through the radio, the first time his people had ever heard him speak. We must endure the unendurable. The war that began with expansion ended with surrender. Allied troops walked through what once had been the heart of an empire. The people bowed, not in submission, but exhaustion. Children searched rubble for food. Mothers rebuilt homes from dust. Amid destruction, a strange peace emerged, fragile, uncertain, but alive. Humanity had survived its own apocalypse, though forever changed by what it had seen. In the ruins of Germany, a new war began. One not of guns, but of ideology. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe, dividing East and West. Soviet soldiers guarded one side. American troops stood on the other. Berlin was split in two, a scar across a wounded continent. Old allies became rivals. New weapons replaced old fears. The Cold War had begun, forged from the heat of the last one. Humanity had defeated tyranny, yet once again stood on the edge of annihilation. Victory had not brought unity. Only a new shadow, darker and quieter than before. At Nuremberg, justice took the stage. The world watched as Nazi leaders faced their crimes before a tribunal of nations. The courtroom was silent, except for the voices of the condemned. We were only following orders. But humanity had learned that obedience was no excuse for evil. The testimonies were haunting. Camps, executions, experiments. The cameras rolled, documenting every tear, every lie, every truth. For the first time in history, war itself was on trial. Nuremberg was not vengeance. It was memory made law. It was humanity's attempt to say, never again, even as it knew how fragile those words truly were. When the soldiers finally returned home, they carried ghosts in their eyes. They had seen too much, friends lost, cities erased, innocence gone. The world tried to rebuild, but nothing felt the same. Women who had powered factories refused to fade back into silence. Colonies demanded independence. A new world was forming from the wreckage of the old. The war had destroyed empires, but also awakened voices long ignored. Out of blood and ruin, movements for equality, justice, and freedom began to rise. Perhaps that was the war's only victory. That, after the darkest night, the human spirit still chose to rise toward light. The scars of war reached beyond the battlefields. Cities rebuilt themselves, but the soul of humanity was still in recovery. Artists painted in silence, poets wrote of ashes, scientists turned their gaze to the stars, searching for meaning beyond destruction. The same technology that birthed the atomic bomb now promised miracles: medicine, flight, communication. Humanity stood at a crossroads between creation and ruin. Could knowledge be trusted again? Could power be guided by wisdom? In the ruins of Hiroshima and Berlin, children played among rubble, unaware they were the first generation of a fragile peace, a peace paid for in fire. In the years that followed, trials turned into textbooks, and the horrors of war became lessons written in history. But memories fade faster than monuments. Survivors spoke to classrooms, their trembling voices warning what happens when hate is left unchecked. Films, photos, diaries, all became echoes of a past too painful to forget. Yet each generation risks forgetting anyway. The uniform changes, the slogans change, but the pattern, fear, division, control, remains. The Second World War was more than a conflict of nations. It was a warning carved into the bones of civilization. This must never happen again. For millions, the war never truly ended. Veterans awoke screaming in the night. Widows stared at empty doorways. Fields where tanks once stood grew wild again, but the ground remembered. In Poland, mass graves whispered through the soil. In Japan, shadows burned into stone still marked where lives had vanished. And yet, amid all that loss, humanity refused to surrender to despair. Memorials rose where cities had fallen. Flowers bloomed where blood once flowed. The world had seen its own reflection. And though it was horrifying, it also revealed something sacred: the unbreakable resilience of life. As the 1950s dawned, technology advanced faster than ever. Rockets touched the edge of space. Machines began to think. But with progress came memory. The scientists building satellites were the same minds once designing weapons. The duality of mankind had never been clearer. Every invention carried both promise and peril. The same mind that could heal could also destroy. The Second World War had ended, but its echo shaped every invention, every fear, every dream that followed. Humanity was racing toward the future. But its shadow, cast by 1945, would always follow close behind. Decades later, survivors grew old, and their voices softened. But their stories never lost their power. A generation that had seen the end of the world spoke gently to those who hadn't. Remember what we paid for your peace. Museums filled with their letters, their uniforms, their photos. Not relics of glory, but reminders of fragility. Children pressed their hands to glass cases, staring at history not as heroes and villains, but as people, scared, brave, flawed, human. And in that understanding lay the true legacy of the war. Not victory, not defeat, but remembrance. Time moved on, but the war remained beneath everything. In policies, in fears, in the silence between nations. The United Nations rose from the ruins, a fragile promise carved from grief. Leaders gathered under its flag, swearing to protect what they had once destroyed. Yet human nature, restless and proud, still lingered in the background. Conflicts changed shape. Weapons evolved. But the ghosts of 1939 still haunted every peace treaty signed. Humanity had built a new world, but its foundation was made of memory. And memory, like glass, can shatter with one careless hand. As decades passed, filmmakers and historians tried to capture what the war truly meant. But film could not convey the smell of smoke, nor words the weight of silence. The Second World War was too vast, too human, to fit into frames or paragraphs. It was not just history, it was emotion made eternal. Every survivor carried an entire world within their eyes. The loss, the courage, the unbearable truth that peace is never free. They lived to remind us that evil doesn't arrive shouting. It whispers, it persuades, it grows where indifference takes root. In small towns across the world, monuments stand quietly at crossroads, names etched in stone, flowers laid at dawn. To some, they're history. To others, family. A grandfather's medal, a grandmother's ration book, a faded photograph. These fragments are all that remain of lives once full of laughter and fear. And as new generations pass by, distracted and safe, those names ask one simple question: will you remember us? For the war's true victory is not in who won or lost. It is in who remembers, who learns, who dares to choose compassion when hate feels easier. Today, the world stands again at crossroads. The same tensions, the same pride, the same hunger for power echo faintly through headlines and speeches. History doesn't repeat, it warns. The Second World War was not a story of the past. It is a mirror for the present. Every generation faces its own test, whether to rise with empathy or fall into apathy. The soldiers, the civilians, the dreamers of that era, they left behind more than ruins. They left a question that still burns. What will you do with the peace we gave you? And so, the echoes of the Second World War linger, not in gunfire, but in conscience. We stand on the shoulders of those who faced unthinkable darkness and chose to fight for light. Their courage is not a relic, it is a responsibility. Every act of kindness, every defense of truth, every refusal to remain silent. These are our battles now. Because history is not just what happened. It is what happens again when we forget. The war may have ended in 1945, but its lesson has no end. When the last survivor closes their eyes, history will not vanish. It will live in us. The Second World War was not merely a clash of nations, but a confrontation with the soul of mankind. It showed that progress without compassion leads to ruin, and power without conscience births monsters. Yet, even in its darkest hour, humanity proved one thing: that the light within us, though fragile, can outshine any night. So listen closely to the silence that follows every explosion, every speech, every headline. That silence is asking us to remember, because in the end, the story of humanity is the echo of the universe. And the echo is asking us to be better,